our point in the Ghost Records paper was if you destroy a specimen, it's inappropriate to call it a preserved specimen. And we've received various arguments that technically you can call something a preserved specimen even if you destroyed it. That's because it was a preserved specimen at the time it was identified. And in my communications with GBIF, that's their official position, is because it was a preserved specimen at the time it was identified, you can call it that even if you deliberately destroy it. And I
Okay.
would argue that that is a very confusing way to do things. Personally, I value the efficient transfer of information more than being technically correct.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is PolliNation, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. I'm so sorry for the long break, but PolliNation is back, and our new season starts with an interesting question that spans back to some of the earliest episodes where we explored the importance of museum collections for understanding past, present, and future distribution of bee species. Now, much of this data is publicly accessible at biodiversity aggregation websites like GBIF, which stands for the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. It might seem that all of these records are backed somewhere by a physical specimen in a museum. But as our next guest points out, this isn't always the case, and this can result in problems. Dr. Zach Portman is no stranger to the podcast. He was back on an episode in episode 165. Zach is one of the few high-level bee taxonomists in the U.S. working in the Carvano Native Bee Lab at the University of Minnesota. This week, he talks about a new paper titled Big Data, Changing Taxonomy and Ghost Records. Permanent preservation of collected specimens is essential for insect monitoring. The article was published in the Annals of the Entomological Society of America and helps reveal the extent of the problem of so-called ghost records, I'm going to call them ghost bees, and the potential consequences. So without further ado, let's dive into the phantasmagoria of ghost bees this week on PolliNation. Welcome back to PolliNation, Zach.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I'm really excited to have you here today. There's a new paper that you and your co-authors put out raising the issue around bee records and specimens that, may not be retained after they're collected and, a name is put on them. Maybe just to set it up for our listeners, what is the kind of standard practice? I mean, people must have it in their head when a bee is collected, what is the process by which it becomes, publicly available data?
Well, I mean, that's a surprisingly complicated question. Like the ideal and like kind of the traditional entomological ways, like someone goes out with a net, they collect some specimens, they pin them up or they preserve them some other way, they make labels for them, they identify them ideally, and then ideally they end up in some kind of natural history museum where they can, contribute to science forever, essentially. Yeah, and that's kind of just the traditional entomological stuff. And, I got my PhD at the Logan Bee Lab, which is like the biggest bee collection, arguably. I'm not sure the exact numbers, but it's a giant collection dedicated to bees, and you just have so many specimens, and you really recognize how important they are, and they're from everywhere, and they provide all this data that's really valuable. And it really is, it's like a window back in time for a lot of things. And so when I think of like collecting, that's what I picture. Like I am contributing specimens to that like museum and contributing them to that kind of broader purpose.
Thanks. That's a really great setup. And I imagine, people have encountered, though, you can look at bee records online. You can see records of bees that have been collected that, have a date and have a location. have a name for the species on them. Why might those not line up? I would imagine most of our listeners would think that each one of those lines correspond with a bee somewhere in the world that you could go and look at. Why does that not necessarily line up?
Oh, so yeah, getting at like the concept of ghost records, I guess.
Yeah, what is a ghost bee?
Yeah, and that's the term we coined is ghost records. And yeah, going into, various projects and everything years ago, I rather naively assumed that like if you go on one of these big databases like GBIF and you see an electronic record that somebody has database and put online, that like you can then go and find it pretty easily.
Hmm.
And probably like the last, I want to say like 5 years, I've been very much disabused of that notion. And it kind of started out when, I first really encountered it when I was putting together the Bees of Minnesota checklist. And there were some records where it was like, this was reported from here, and then you try and verify that, and it leads nowhere. And then there's other times where it's like, you email people looking for records and like you don't get a response or like, oh, actually that didn't exist. I encountered that kind of early on as well with some of the like the Rusty Patch Bumblebee records, like yeah, Bombus affinis. And so that still occurs in Minnesota. It's had these big declines. And in some of the early old maps from like that were from the Fish and Wildlife Service, like they have their hotspot maps. And there was back a few years ago, there were ones on that map from like northern Minnesota. And people went and they looked and tried to find Rusty Patch Bumblebee like in those areas. And then at some point, we tried verifying those records.
Hmm.
And it turned out that most of those ones from northern Minnesota were either based on misidentifications or there was no photo or specimen to actually back them up.
Huh.
And this had a real impact because you have people like going to those locations, thinking it's a historic location, trying to look for that species. And then you look back and it was all just kind of wasted effort in a way.
Okay, so these are two, I can see how that would be a shock to you first in doing the checklist, trying to, a reasonable endeavor to figure out which bees have been historically reported in Minnesota and having these reports, but never, discovering that bees that might have been in the state that you want to go look at or have sent to you just to confirm, it can't be confirmed. And then in this second case where, this is a federal recovery program for an endangered bee that you're trying to sort of get a sense of its historic range and discover that because the specimen isn't there, it could be a misidentified bee. There's really no, it's just cloaked in ambiguity at that point. So the record, I imagine one can't, really rely on it anymore.
Yeah, there's one thing I've learned is that these records are not reliable. And oftentimes, like, there's various reasons. Like sometimes databases aren't maintained, sometimes labs, they end, like whoever retires, and you can't track down their specimens. Sometimes somebody uploads something to a database. I've encountered this, and they want to get it removed, but don't have access anymore and can't figure out how.
Oh, wow. Okay.
In the case of our recent Ghost Records paper, it seems like it's just not something that is really even kept track of. Like they're reported as, specimens located here, but that's just kind of the default thing that they fill in for the records.
Oh, so if a specimen was destroyed, there's a way using these standard database fields to indicate that it has been discarded or destroyed or for something like that it could be annotated to the record.
Yeah, you could change it. Like there have been people who have argued various points on this, which I think are kind of silly arguments. But yes, there are absolutely things like you can change various things like disposition. Our our point in the Ghost Records paper was like, if you destroy a specimen, it's inappropriate to call it a preserved specimen. And we've received various arguments that like technically you can call something a preserved specimen even if you destroyed it. And that's because it was a preserved specimen at the time it was identified. And in my communications with GBIF, that's their official position, is because it was a preserved specimen at the time it was identified, you can call it that even if you deliberately destroy it. And I
Okay.
would argue that that is a very confusing way to do things. Personally, I value the efficient transfer of information more than being, technically correct.
Yes, and because it does leave, again, person developing a state checklist or somebody working on a threatened and endangered species, a sense of a solidity to that data point, which, may be warranted, but may not be warranted, and there's no way to verify it.
Yes, my sense of the solidity of those records is, down the drain. I think as a good rule of thumb, if it's in a traditional natural history museum, you can usually trust that the record is good and the specimen is there. There are always, various errors and mistakes and georeferencing errors or data entry errors that can pop up. And sometimes you get in touch with the collection and they say, I looked for the specimen and I can't find it. It doesn't happen that often, but it definitely happens.
Hmm.
Yeah, if it's not in a traditional museum though, I my default state is now just not to trust it.
Not only have you come to this conclusion, but you've also been able to estimate the extent of which this problem exists. Tell us a little bit about the approach of the paper. I imagine just when you were sitting there frustrated with, records that seemingly had specimens that were in a museum that weren't there, you probably started to, think about like how to describe this problem, how to, put some, contours on the extent of the problem. How did you and your group end up asking this question? How do you approach that problem?
Well, it's a little complicated. I mean, the impetus for this project, we kind of came at it sideways. We weren't in the beginning intending to tackle this issue of ghost records. Yeah, it goes back a few years. And the big impetus for me, like originally I was I had this little project where I was thinking about like a national bee monitoring program. And I was trying to do some rough calculations about like the numbers and investments and kind of see whether it was feasible. And one of the big questions about like probably the biggest question about that was like, what do you do with all the specimens? Because by most of the proposals out there, you are going to end up with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of specimens. And so that's kind of where we got. And then, or that's where I started. And then as I was kind of plugging into that, we kind of stumbled across this idea that like the only way that some people are doing this and making it feasible is they're just sidestepping that issue entirely. Like they're not saving the specimens, if that makes sense. And then there was kind of this parallel thing. And that was one aspect. And then the other aspect was like just playing around with different data sets. Because one thing I like to do is like when people publish papers on bees, the first thing I do is I download the species list. Often I'll download the data and just like see what it looks like and what the kind of rough trends are.
Hmm.
And that's something I did with camera et al. Paper at one point. And so I just downloaded, I was looking at the species, and one thing that stood out is, there are species that like kind of pop out of nowhere. And that I think was the big thing that was like, oh, there are taxonomic artifacts in this data. Let's see how deep they go. And then, 3 years later, we ended up with this paper. So it was a kind of a couple of different things where we ended up at this. And the kind of ghost record concept is one that kind of came in towards the end, but was a good way to describe a lot of these issues that I'd been dealing with from all sorts of things, whether it's like putting together the state checklist, looking at these species of conservation concern, or just like looking at these data sets.
Uh,
Hopefully that got at your question. It was a little bit meandering.
yeah, well, it does. It kind of it motivates the project, but the question I'm curious, I think our listeners would like to hear is how were you able to kind of like come up with an estimate of the extent of the problem? I'm sure there are some specimens that are held and some that are not, and it could be a big problem, it could be a minor problem. In the paper, you really, do a good job of describing the extent of the problem. Can you just walk our listeners through the methodology that you used to try and understand the problem, or at least define it and make it visible to the rest of us?
Yeah. And that's the thing is like it is really difficult to estimate the extent of the problem. And so the approach that we chose was focusing on these common abundant groups that have undergone taxonomic changes and just kind of looking at that data to see if they leave an obvious signal. And so like the big example is something like, you know, Serotina mcmackii. And that was recently described. It was in like 2010 or 2011 or something. And so if you look at it in the data, it kind of shows up during that time period. And there's like barely a handful of records from before then. And the reason for that is like, Serotina mcmackii has always been there, but before it was described, it was being, lumped with Serotina dupla and calcarata mostly. So it kind of creates this weird artifact where if you're looking at just the data, it seems like maybe this bee just exploded onto the scene, but that's just an artifact of
Ah.
our inability to identify it.
So this is a bee that didn't that was sort of intertwined in other species concepts until somebody went through and did the work, and then suddenly it's broken out. And so it appears suddenly because the person who's doing the determination understands the new species, but all of the ones that are left behind, all the ones before that date of the revision are going they'll be clumped in with, you can't tell them apart from these other species names. So if you only have, okay, that's clear to me. So you should see a species popping up.
Yeah, and the way to fix that is you go back and you find all the old Serotina dupla and Serotina calcarata and you re-identify them using
Right.
these updated species concepts. And if you did that, then your data would be fixed and you'd probably get like a nice kind of steady occurrence. It has kind of bigger ramifications because it means that a lot of the old stuff that was identified is wrong. Like the Serotina mcmackii are in there somewhere, but unless you go back and look at those specimens, you can't figure out which ones.
Okay, so that will lead this kind of gives you a sense of the magnitude of the problem, I suppose.
Yeah, and so the Serotina mcmackii is kind of the simple version. And it gets really, really absurdly complicated when you get into like lazy glossum, and especially the dialectics, because that's one where Jason Gibbs went and he revised the US species and the Canadian species in 2010 and 2011. And the taxonomic changes, as you can imagine, are not straightforward. Like a lot of species were split, some species were lumped, and a lot of them, there isn't kind of a one-to-one change between old and new species boundaries. Like, if you have like an old species, like some of them became one thing, some of them became another, some kind of or various mixtures. You have the case of something like Lasioglossum calidum, where the just definition changed. So the name has been in continuous usage, but before Gibbs, it referred to one species, and after Gibbs, it refers to a totally different species, but
Oh,
they
goodness.
have the same name. And so those, like some of those have that same pattern you see in Serotina mcmackii, where they just kind of jump on the scene after the revision. But some of them, those changes occurred, but they don't leave an obvious signal in the data just because the changes are so complicated. So to
Okay.
kind of answer your original question, like we essentially went through and took all these species that have had like major changes to their definition, and we, just counted up all those old records and said, we estimate that this many have been invalidated by these taxonomic changes. And the only way to fix them is to go back, look at them under a microscope, and give them a new determination.
And I guess you were working also with a data set where there was destructive sampling of the specimen, so you could then draw the conclusion of, the percentage of the, of those groups that, clearly can't be told apart now retrospectively.
Yes. And I forget what the exact numbers we came to, but like it's a little biased because the data that we looked at, it's mostly collected using bowl traps. So there's a lot of lazy glossum. And then something like 50% of those lazy glossum specimens are of species that have had major changes to their taxonomy. So when you add up like what percent of all the data from like before 2010 needs to be rechecked because it's been invalidated by these taxonomic changes, it comes out to like, I want to say, I forget the numbers, but it was like a quarter of the data essentially, like a really high number. And the thing is, like this, we were just focusing on these groups because they like fell nicely in the middle.
Hmm.
There's other ones like, there's been revisions of Epiolus where we changed the Ogochloropsis and Agaposmin species concepts. Like as you do more taxonomic changes, like these changes continue to accumulate and more old records continue to be invalidated by these changes. So as taxonomy progresses, it just the pool of data that's like
Hmm.
more or less good is smaller and smaller and smaller because our taxonomy is always changing. Like we're very far from like perfect taxonomy, especially in beasts. There's a lot of undescribed species, there's a lot of cryptic species, and we're still just working through them.
So that it cascades over time, that you start to have an error that then compounds the next time, and then I guess that becomes, the value starts to diminish.
Yeah, and the only thing you can really do at that point is like lump everything that used to be in there into like a species complex, and you can never tell which species you actually had.
I suppose, and this comes up in the paper, I suppose one practice, if you do, you're running into, as you pointed at the beginning, the very real space limitations that a large monitoring program is going to come up against. And you have to discard specimens that you might retain vouchers of morphogroups, kind of very morphologically variable examples within a species that might be able to be pulled out. I suppose that is of limited use, but it can help a little bit.
Yeah, it can help, and I think it depends on your goals. But yeah, especially in something like lazy lesson, vouchers are not going to allow you to reconstruct specimens that no longer exist. You're only going to be able to point to the specimens you have in hand and be like, these are now correct.
Hmm.
So yeah, the vouchers are of limited use. And that's something, if you read that Packer et al. Paper, the validating taxonomic something
Hmm.
that we discussed a little bit, like they talk about this more in depth. And their recommendation is to save every specimen when possible. But yeah, I think, and in general, like I kind of disagree where you say like, you need to discard stuff.
Hmm.
I would argue that if you don't have the capacity to store the specimens that you collect, you should not be collecting them in the first place.
You've
Because
made the
it's
point
just,
elsewhere as well that, some sampling effort, repeatedly collects, maybe very common and interesting bees and with very little scientific value that can take up a lot of room if you were to properly store them.
yes. But I would say stop collecting that way. If that's the issue, like,
Yeah.
you know, if you're swamp with specimens, go out with a net and target things more selectively. Don't just do the equivalent of trawling only to throw away, 90 some percent of things just because you're after something specific. Like, yeah, I think like part of doing a good project is being able to do all of it from beginning to end. And if you can only do like the first 90% of it, like you, it just doesn't make sense. It's kind of like, you build a house, but you leave off the roof. Like I would say you have not built a house.
There's one really great line in the paper on the recommendations that funding agencies that, are typically, the blood that makes these projects run ought to have that in mind, that, the kind of project's conclusion, which means the storage of the specimens, if it's not in the grant and written into the grant, then that should raise a red flag. It seems like a sensible.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. Like that is really important. And unfortunately in B stuff and other projects, like you see a lot of people jumping in, not necessarily planning for that kind of stuff or budgeting for it. So it's really important to like know where your specimens are going before you even collect them. And and it is sad because like a lot of natural history museums are short of funds and have been for years, and there's fewer taxonomists, there's fewer positions. But like one way to help fix that is by making sure that you fund this stuff in advance and aren't just like collecting a bunch of specimens and then going to the museum and be like, please take these.
Yeah.
And we in here we work very closely with the University of Minnesota insect collection, and they take all our stuff, and we buy a lot of supplies and materials. Like we bought them drawers and cabinets and helped pay for technicians. Like it's not cheap. It requires a lot of investment. But I am heartened like with a lot of the funders, like, whether it's federal or state or, other kind of funding agencies, like a lot of them, they don't know about these kind of details, but once you explain them, like they get it and they're willing to, you know, fund that kind of stuff. But oftentimes, like if you don't bring it up as something that needs to be done, like it's just not on their radar.
No, it isn't. It's true, and our practice here has been to invest. We've got a section of the Oregon State Arthropod collection where we've made sure that we've got space for expansion, not just for current holdings. I suppose maybe sort of to wrap this up, there is the issue of the publications. So a lot of this work is out there. I mean, it's being, records that may have, we might have problems really knowing the species identity and that's being reported, especially after they've been aggregated and turned into a nice figure. What is sort of to be done with that? How are we to proceed? Because clearly, as taxonomy keeps moving, so does, conservation science and, the need to act. How should we think about that?
I'm not sure what you mean. Like, what are you trying to get at with that question?
Yeah, I guess, listing decisions or other conservation decisions are pending or being, petitioned,
Mhm.
or, there's a
Yeah.
need for regulators for science, and, this data is being used. And I suppose what's a sensible way to kind of, not stall the conservation work, but also not to proceed blindly down an alley that is, maybe fraught with a lot of uncertainty, more uncertainty than is
Yeah.
apparent on the surface, I
I
suppose.
mean, I think, realistically, like the best thing that people can do is, again, that Packer et al. Publication where they kind of lay out what are the best practices for, collecting specimens. And they get at a lot of this, like saving the specimens or at least saving vouchers of the specimens can help with that issue. And that way you don't have papers reporting species that then,
Mm.
you can't verify or you have to spend a ton of effort hunting down. So I have another project with a number of collaborators where we're doing a similar thing with Bombus sucklei, which has been petitioned to be endangered, has a positive 12-month finding. And we have the data that the Fish and Wildlife Service used to assess this bee. And so I have a question for you if you want to guess. I think there are 14 records of Bombus sucklei in the US since from 2010 or later. And we've done a decent job tracking down all those records. How many of those do you think are actually Bombus sucklei?
After 2010?
Yes,
I don't think any of them are.
close. Two of them.
Oh.
So 2 out of 14 are verifiable sucklei. The others were either misidentified or unverifiable, like there
Huh.
was
I'll
no
have to check.
specimen or the specimen is lost or destroyed.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so yeah, like this data was used by the Fish and Wildlife Service to assess the bee, and that kind of the end result is that it looks like it's doing better than it is. And there's people looking for it in places where it's not or hasn't been for a very long
Hmm.
time. So it definitely has a real world impact. And so, yeah, if it was up to me, I think everyone would save all of their specimens. They would have a plan for what to do with them before they even collect them. And they will have a plan for what they do when they retire and their lab ends. Because there's a lot of people in that situation where they're kind of nearing retirement and they have some thousands of specimens and they're like, oh, I've never really thought about this next step.
I inherited a few drawers of Bill Stevens stuff, and it was,
Mhm.
I think all the good stuff had gone over to the museum, but there was a whole bunch of material that, including some Occidentalis records and some Franklin's records that just didn't have location labels on them.
And we've had a similar thing with Catherine Reed's collection here in Minnesota, where she collected a bunch of bees in the 90s and had a big personal collection. And a lot of that was used for outreach. And then, we're some 20 some years later or 30 years later, and it's like, oh, actually, maybe we should be taking those Bombus affinis specimens out of these outreach drawers because they're actually really important and valuable now.
Yeah. Well, I think that's great, sensible advice. And as somebody who's non-expert who works in this area, I certainly have taken schooling from it. So I really appreciate you working on this problem and bringing it to everybody's attention. I think it's a really, really useful thought piece, this paper. And I encourage our listeners to take a read because it's open access. So anybody can look through it.
Yeah, and I think this is something it seems like it's going to be a growing problem as more and more people are kind of pressured to put their data out there and people continue to try and like hunt down this stuff. Yeah, I feel badly for people who are going to be trying to put together state lists in states where there's, tons of ghost records because there's just no easy way to do that. Like it's just going to be so much work, you're almost better off just starting over from scratch and disregarding a lot of the old research.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for taking the time. I'm also going to double duty you here this evening. You're going to join us for the Master Melitologist Catch a Buzz right after. So I'll give you a few minutes to take a break. But thank you so much for explaining this problem to us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.